Hello, my name is Richard Lee and ready to teach another lesson in defending the Christian worldview against all other worldviews using the presuppositional apologetics method. Now, if you saw the last video, I just want to make a couple of corrections. Just to be sure, when I talked about the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6, you can start reading at about verse 4. Well, actually, go back to verse 1, but the word Shema, the Hebrew word Shema, which has to do with hearing, and I would even say hearing with understanding, that's in verse 4. I really don't know if I was really clear on that. Another thing, in talking about Adam's age, I think I said something to the effect that Adam lived to be 120. Well, I misspoke there, and I knew better. Adam, after Cain slew Abel, if you go to Genesis chapter 5, you'll see that Adam had another son by the name of Seth, and he was about 130 years of age then, but ultimately you'll see that Adam lived to be over 900 years in age. Men were living much longer then than we do now. And just a little bit on the humorous side, I talked about my son Kevin, and you actually got a chance to meet him in the background. He walked past the window a couple of times. He walked by trying not to come in the door to disturb and make a loud noise, but I thought it was a little bit humorous and decided to leave it in. Now, today we're going to talk about atheism, but I want to just really, before we get into talking about atheism, just talk about a couple of preliminaries. We're going to be assuming that you're talking to your friends or family members or associates, any person that you happen to engage in a conversation with, and you happen to find out that they're an atheist. Well, first of all and foremost, if they're a friend or family member, I suppose that this wouldn't be really anything new that they're atheists to you if that's what they profess to be. So one of the things that you definitely want to do as you're talking to people is you want to first be a good listener. And therefore you want to ask questions to begin to engage that individual. Now, in so doing, there are a couple things to keep in mind. One of the things, as the person is talking, you want to really look for arbitrary statements. And what do I mean by arbitrary? I'm going to read definitions again just to be sure. This is from Merriam-Webster's 11th College Edition Collegiate Dictionary. It says arbitrary, dependent upon individual discretion. Moving down to number 3, which is really the one that I really want to read, it says based on or determined by individual preference or convenience rather than by necessity or intrinsic nature of something, an arbitrary standard. Existing or coming about seemingly at random or by chance, or as a capricious or unreasonable act of will. And I think capricious really defines that word very well in the way that I intend to use it. And another thing that you don't want to allow, you want to look for inconsistent conversation or inconsistent arguments. And I don't really like to use that word argument because some people think that when you're talking about an argument that you're talking about a knockdown, drag out battle. But inconsistent, that's not compatible with another fact or claim. containing incompatible elements, incoherent or illogical in thought or actions, not satisfiable by the same set of values for the unknowns. So those are a couple of things that you don't want to allow in the conversation. So as you're listening to the person that you're talking to, make note of those things. Now, I've said this before, and I'm going to keep saying this through these series of lessons. First and foremost, you need to understand what your presuppositions are. And by presupposition, I simply mean assumption. Everybody has them. You has them. You have them. If I can get the grammar correct, you have them, and the person that you're talking to has them also. You must realize that the person that you're talking to may not really even understand. They may not have really even thought about what their presuppositions are and what their assumptions are. But if you listen and you're astute, you'll be able to ascertain what their presuppositions are. And what we're going to do in this lesson, we'll begin to point out to the atheist some of their presuppositions. You must understand that it's impossible to act or think or dialogue without the presuppositions. You know, Greg Bunsen used to talk about not being neutral. He says you shouldn't be neutral, and the person that you're talking to is not neutral. Well, after reflecting upon that, he's talking about these presuppositions. Again, it's an impossibility to get rid of them. You must know what they are. That would be like removing your skin. You know, if you look, you know, it's a part of you. But the difference is with presuppositions, if you find that one is in error, you can change that. But believe me, you're going to have to be very, very good to convince me that God does not exist. You're going to have to be very, very good. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're going to be defending the Christian worldview. Just to recap, what's a worldview? The definition that I'm giving, and the atheist is not going to agree with this definition. That's a worldview is a network of presuppositions that are not verified through means of natural science, and that's where the atheist is going to have a problem regarding metaphysics, which is reality and ontology, the nature of being. Epistemology, that's how do you know what you know? Everybody at some point in time talks about what they know and how they know it, or what they don't know and how they know, and how and what it is that they don't know, and you know, you may get into some detail as to why they don't know. And ethics, that's the third leg. You know, and there's no way that an atheist can use means of natural science to determine what's ethically right or wrong. They can't do that. We're going to talk about atheism and the agnosticism. I'm not going to spend much time with agnosticism. Just suffice it to say that if you're talking to a person that's an agnostic, you want to ask questions to try to narrow in as to where the agnosticism lies. What is it that they don't know? Are they unsure whether God exists at all, or does the uncertainty come into, okay, yeah, I'm certain that God exists, but out of all of the possibilities, how do I know which God to follow? You want to hone in and narrow that down, and then once you find that out, then you can speak from one of the points of view that I'm going to do in this series of lessons. Now, as usual, I'm going to read some Bible verses, and the first three sets of verses I'm going to read from Proverbs. I read these in earlier lessons, but I think that it is paramount to begin to hone in on the presupposition or the assumption of the atheist. The first one that I'm going to read is from the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verse 19. The Lord, that's Yahweh, by wisdom founded the earth, and by understanding he established the heavens. See, the atheist says that everything is material and that wisdom and understanding came after the material. Well, my presupposition is that the wisdom was always there. That's Yahweh. Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22 to 29 reads, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way. And again, if you go back to verse 1 and read down, which I'm not going to do, you'll see that it's talking about wisdom. The Lord, that's Yahweh, possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From everlasting I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills I was brought forth. While he had not yet made the earth and the fields, nor the first dust of the world. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he inscribed a circle on the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above. When the springs of the deep became fixed, when he set for his sea its boundary so that the water would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth. See, wisdom was there. Yahweh always possessed wisdom. And another one, again, I've read this before, Proverbs 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now let me read some verses that I hadn't read. We're going to go over to the Psalm 14, verse 1. And if you read Psalm 14, you can look at Psalm 53. Compared to the two Psalms, you'll see that they're almost identical. Psalm 14:1 reads, the fool has said in his heart, that's in his innermost being, deep down, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. Well, now we're getting into the ethical standpoint from God's point of view. But the fool says that there is no God. I was talking to a gentleman yesterday, and he says he's never met a true atheist. Well, that's really interesting. But there are some people that if you talk to them, they will tell you that they're an atheist. Now, this is the key verse that I want to read in this lesson, and this is back to the book of Proverbs, chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. This is a twofold apologetical method. Listen to this verse, or these two verses, carefully. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will also be like him. In other words, don't be like the fool. Don't answer him, and don't be like him. Don't answer the fool according to his folly, or you will be like him. And then answer a fool as his folly deserves, that he not be wise in his own eyes. In other words, you want to let the person know that they're not really wise. Now, some people might look and think that these two verses are contradicting each other, but they're not. If you really stop and think about it, it's a twofold approach. And you could use either one or both of them, and the order doesn't matter. You may do verse 5 before verse 4, but when you're talking to the person that doesn't follow God, then think of this method. So now, one thing that you want to keep in mind, if you're talking to an atheist, and you're always going to want to ask anyone that you're talking to, back to this epistemology, how do you know? You know, what you just said, how do you know that that's true? What do you base it upon? Well, guess what? Let me turn around and ask you, how do you know? They may say, prove the existence of God. Well, understand what I'm about to say. And I'm gonna make three statements really, and they're really equivalent statements. They're really all about the same. But you want to say something to the effect that unless Christianity were true, you couldn't prove anything. Now, I'll really expound upon this a little bit more as we really get into the meat of this lesson. Or again, you may say something to the effect that if there were no God, and again, I'm not talking about God in general. That's why I like really the first version better, unless Christianity were true. But if there were no God, you couldn't know it, and you wouldn't be able to prove anything. Or as Bunsen, when he talked about Cornelius Van Til, he said Van Til talked about the concept of the precondition for intelligibility. In other words, as I said earlier, intelligence was there before matter. It was not the other way around, as the atheist has to assume. There are really going to be two major areas of atheism that really converge into one, but I like to break it out because people may be an atheist for one of these two major reasons. Again, this person may really be into science, into the natural world, and they're going to say that that's all there is. There's matter, there's nothing else. Or they may come to the conclusion, well, God can exist because of all of the evil that they see. We're going to talk about evil, again, ethics, in another lesson. I'm going to try to devote a lesson completely to that later on, but I want to cycle through the entire cycle of all of the isms and then come back to atheism. And I may do, I don't know, 3 or 4 lessons on atheism. I could do a lot more, but you'll get the point after a while. The atheist really does not have a leg to stand on at all. Now, as I mentioned, the atheist is going to say, the person that's materialistically minded, that person is going to say that the only thing that exists are atoms. And I don't know if you remember from high school or college, or I don't know how much you are into physics, but an atom consists of a nucleus with neutrons and protons, and then electrons are circling the atom. And today, people may really talk about subatomic particles, quarks and neutrinos. People may really talk about the quantum, which they say do not obey the laws of physics. You know, it acts differently. Things at the subatomic quantum level do not behave in the manner as things at the atomic level. Well, these are some terms. You don't have to be an expert in physics, but just think about a few things. This next point, and this is where we're going to really begin to talk about the asininity of atheism. And I'm going to throw out this term, this phrase, it's the inference to intelligence. Again, according to what we read just a little earlier, wisdom was there, intelligence was there. So what do I mean by talking about the inference to intelligence? Well, if we talk about an improbable object or event, you know, something that's really out of place, and it's a recognizable pattern. Let me give you some examples. This first picture here is a picture that was drawn of me by my grandson. And to me, it's really amusing because he captured the wrinkles in my forehead and all. And you can see that it took intelligence to do this drawing. Now, what does this have to do with the atheistic worldview? Well, given the atheistic worldview, if atoms just came together and, you know, came together in such a way that in the end, you know, they became molecules and cells, and then out popped you and me, then given 4.5 billion years, again, the twofold apologetical approach from Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. Given the atheistic point of view, the materialistic point of view, why is it not possible, given 4.5 billion years, that the atoms just arrange themselves in a piece of paper, and then the picture pops up automatically? Why is that not possible? Well, that's what the atheist assumes, if you stop and think about it. Here's another example. A picture of that someone drew in the sand. And we know someone drew this picture in the sand. It says, Jesus loves you. Now again, given the atheistic point of view, and let's take 4.5 billion years, well, let's double it. Let's be generous. What's 4.5 times 2? Let's give them 9 billion years. And let's, you know, given their point of view, with the water washing up on the sand and the wind blowing, why can't a pattern such as this just come into being on its own? I mean, we're talking about atoms. You know, ask the atheist, does an atom have a mind? Is it able to think? Does it, you know, at the atomic level, is there intelligence? Well, by definition, it can have intelligence if it's not alive. But again, if the atheist wants to say that the atom is alive and that at the atomic level that it has intelligence, again, that's their assumption. I mean, I'm not an expert in science, but I do know that the cell is made up of atoms. It's not the other way around. I know that much. Here's another picture, Stone Mountain. I've been there I don't know how many times. But again, given 9 billion years, let's be generous, let's give them 100 billion years. Again, with the wind blowing against the rock, you know, maybe we've had an earthquake or two, and why wouldn't we see this picture just come up in this big rock? Now, some people might say that the person that got up there, and I don't know exactly how they did it, and carved this picture of these three men on horses in this rock, that he didn't have much intelligence. But you get the point. It's my understanding. Here's a picture of Mount Rushmore in 2016. 3 years ago, I got a chance to go there. I've always wanted to go there. The same thing would apply. Why not, given 100 billion years, why not see in a mountain a picture of four faces pop up? Now, it's my understanding that the person that did Mount Rushmore is the same person that did Stone Mountain. I don't know. It's really not that important to me. What I do know is that it took intelligence to put those pictures in the rock, to carve those forms in the rock. And this last one is a picture of Crazy Horse. We got a chance to see that while we were out there. But the same principle applies. You understand what I'm saying. Given the atheist worldview, it should be possible for these patterns to just appear. Now, we're going to talk, not in this lesson, but in another lesson on atheism, we're going to talk about induction. What I've talked about here is really the principle of induction, and think of it as a probability. Scientists use induction all the time. If you played the lottery, think about it. Hitting the lottery, I don't know, for $40 billion the first night, but think about hitting it 300, let's just say for a year. What if you hit the lottery every day in a row for a year? I mean, what chance, what probability would you give for that? Well, again, given the atheist worldview, and as I said, we'll get more into induction in another lesson, but given the atheist worldview, that's a possibility. Given their worldview, they're saying that matter just came into being, and it began to live, and it became intelligent. Well, I'm not going to go with that worldview. I don't have enough faith to believe in that. Now, one of the other areas that we want to talk about is computers and cell phones. I mean, you're either watching me on a computer or on your cell phone, or maybe you're not really watching the video, maybe you're just listening. I've been putting up pictures, so hopefully you'll get a chance to watch it and see some of these pictures. Given the atheistic worldview, a computer should be able to make itself. The reason that I want to talk about computer is because they are information processors. Your cell phone is an information processor. So I just want to talk a little bit about information, and in a later lesson, especially when we really get into DNA, we'll talk a little bit about it now. Scientists always talk about the information that's being processed in DNA, or the information that's being utilized in cells and everything. And so that just reminds me of the computer. I don't care if you're talking about a picture, a motion picture such as you're watching, or audio such as what you're listening to, or a document. That's information that's represented inside of a computer or your cell phone. Now I'm going to put this a couple of bit patterns up. This is the code. It's known as EBCDIC, Extended Binary Coded Decimal Interchange Code. I forget exactly what the acronym stands for. But I used to program. I programmed professionally for a little over 10 years. And this is what I used primarily. You know, the big mainframe computers that I programmed on used EPSDIC. That's an 8-bit pattern. I'm just going to put up, just so that you can see how information is represented and to understand the concept. This first bit pattern is a pattern of a capital A. And this next pattern is represents the lowercase a. The point is, it took intelligence to put this together. Just by definition, if you think of information, I mean, here you're trying to store and retrieve information. You're trying to inform someone either through a photograph or music or a document. Well, when you get to DNA, who or what is DNA trying to inform? But scientists will always talk about the information that's represented inside of the DNA molecule. Now let's take this again to another level that's absurd. But given the atheist worldview, these absurdities, and we've pointed out some, they should be possible. You and I started out as a single cell. You know, actually, you had a sperm cell and it united with an egg cell. And, you know, I believe that the scientific name is that they were gametes at that time. And then through the process of meiosis, the cell divided and over many iterations, after 9 months, you and I came out. A healthy baby, and you know, in some instances, maybe a baby that's not healthy. But, you know, it's going to come out looking like a human. But again, given the atheist worldview, why? You see, in that initial cell, and God put it there, all of the information is needed. That is needed to get to you and me is passed on. You know, information comes from your mother and your father, but it's stored in that single cell. You know, information to produce eyes and a nose and a mouth and arms and legs and eye color. All of that information is there. But given the atheist worldview, why is it not possible for two human beings to get together and have a giraffe? Let's stop and think. That's absurd, and I meant it to be absurd. Makes no sense. But if you've got mindless atoms that come together and form molecules and then cells and begin to live, but they're mindless, why is it not possible to have a giraffe from two humans? Or, you know, why not an elephant? Boy, oh boy, I'd hate to be a woman that's pregnant with an elephant. I'm laughing. You know, it's meant to be absurd. Go back to Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. What are you going to do? You want to point out the absurdities to the person that you're talking to. You want to point them out. And the atheists and everybody are going to say, well, first of all, with evolution, they're going to say, well, over time, you know, Darwin proved that we all came from apes. Well, hey, we'll talk about that. First of all, Darwin doesn't even begin to talk about how life originated. He talks about what may have happened after life had already begun. So he doesn't talk about life coming from non-life. But again, given the worldview of the atheist, why not go backwards? I mean, hey, why not have a human being produce a monkey? Hey, I mean, why not? If the atom is mindless. I want to read one more verse to close this off. And that's from the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 18 to 22. And it reads, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, deep down." You know, and that's why that individual that I was talking to that says he hadn't met an atheist, deep down, we all know that there's something more. For God made it evident to them. God says, look out there in nature, and you can see that it just didn't happen by chance. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. God says you really don't have an excuse. He says you don't have an excuse at all. And then it goes on to say, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. But they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Well, I'm going to close this lesson out on atheism. As I said, I'm not finished. After I go through the complete cycle, I will come back. But next, I'm going to talk about deism. And deism basically is a person that does believe that God exists. And we're going to talk about how to talk to the deist in the next lesson. I hope to see you then.